The Rhodesian Bush War, which ravaged the small southern African nation of Rhodesia from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s, was one of the most brutal and devastating conflicts on the African continent in the late 20th century. A war defined by horrific violence, sickening atrocities, and devastating loss of life on all sides, the conflict saw the minority white colonial government engaged in a bloody struggle to maintain its power against African nationalist guerrilla forces seeking to overthrow the regime and establish black majority rule. Allegations of war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons and acts of domestic terrorism, were traded back and forth across the divide during this period, making the Bush War one of the most morally murky and confusing chapters in Africa's post-colonial history. While the ultimate outcome is known, Rhodesia no longer exists, having transitioned to the modern nation of Zimbabwe after a negotiated settlement in 1979. The path to this outcome was filled with shocking brutality and tactical twists. For years, Rhodesia's security forces won battle after battle against their guerrilla foes, displaying ruthlessness and operational effectiveness that made them seem nearly unstoppable, at least according to the Rhodesian media's propaganda-filled reports. So how did the Rhodesian Army and police, the losing side in the war, manage to achieve such tactical successes against the guerrillas while still failing to achieve their overarching strategic objectives? Examining the origins and evolution of the conflict provides insight into this discrepancy. The seeds of racial unrest and insurgency were planted in Rhodesia as far back as the 1950s, when the first African nationalist opposition groups emerged demanding greater political rights and representation. The Rhodesian government responded with typical heavy-handedness, banning opposition groups like the African National Congress, arresting leaders, and completely excluding black Africans from any meaningful role in the political process. By the early 1960s, banned groups like the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, and the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, turned to violence guided by leaders like Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. Though outgunned and outnumbered, the Rhodesian security forces who confronted these first guerrilla attacks were hardened veterans of counterinsurgency, having spent years fighting communist rebels while serving the British Empire in conflicts across Asia. Crucially, the geopolitics of southern Africa in the 1960s aided the Rhodesian efforts. White supremacist regimes in apartheid South Africa and Portuguese-controlled Mozambique flanked Rhodesia, providing a buffer against external support for the guerrillas. Internally, the nationalists also undermined their own efforts by focusing on small-scale raids rather than trying to mobilize grassroots support within the black population. Rhodesian forces exploited these weaknesses ruthlessly, developing formidable counter-guerrilla tactics and intelligence capabilities over time. But the tide began to turn in the 1970s as Zimbabwe's nationalist militants learned from their mistakes. The guerrillas focused more on recruiting fighters internally as well as bringing forces in from neighboring countries. They also prioritized gaining the support and collaboration of the local black population. In contrast, heavy-handed Rhodesian reprisals against villages suspected of collaborating with the insurgents backfired, sowing resentment and pushing more locals into the guerrilla camp. As the 1970s continued, the conflict took on a new intensity as larger, more sophisticated and coordinated guerrilla offensives were launched against Rhodesian security forces. No longer were the insurgents relying on small-scale hit-and-run raids. Even as the Rhodesians refined their tactical counterinsurgency capabilities over a decade of fighting, they began to face strategic challenges on new fronts. Growing diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions imposed by the international community took a toll. By the late 1970s, Rhodesia's position was increasingly untenable despite the tactical victories its security forces had notched on the battlefield. A guerrilla insurgency that had adapted and reinvented itself now enjoyed widespread support from the local population as well as backing from key neighboring countries. Concerted pressure from foreign governments eroded what stability remained within Rhodesia. In the end, no amount of tactical proficiency could have enabled Rhodesia's security forces to overcome the array of strategic and political challenges stacking the deck against them as the war dragged on. Isolated abroad, reviled at home as their brutality stoked anti-government sentiment, and facing an increasingly sophisticated foe, the formidable Rhodesian military found tactical success impossible to translate into overall victory. Only extensive negotiations and a political settlement could halt the descent into bloodshed, leading to the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979, which brought recognized independence and black majority rule. Rhodesia ceased to exist as the new Republic of Zimbabwe was born from its bitter ashes, with Robert Mugabe rising to power on the back of the war's revolutionary momentum. The story of the Rhodesian Bush War stands as a testament to how lopsided tactical capabilities are not enough for an unpopular regime to defeat a determined insurgency with local support and international legitimacy. In the end, Rhodesia's security forces won battle after battle, but still lost the war.